So I've been very much looking forward to this conversation, not only because Rebecca is one of my favorite writers, having written two of my all-time favorite books, River of Shadows and Wanderlust, but also because after such a stimulating day that we've just had, coming towards the end of all of the energy and urgency of Climate Week, I'm eager to introduce questions of culture into the conversation, which we started to hint at a little bit in the last panel, but I think are really important to bring to the fore, especially in terms of American cultural attitudes and how they pervade the roots of the problem that we've been talking around all day, how they've obstructed our ability to respond to the very real existential threats that we've created for ourselves, but also maybe how they might enable us to do a little bit better going forward. Let's hope. We've talked a lot about cities today. We've talked a lot about New York, but in the context of a project like the 5,000 Pound Life, which takes sort of a national frame, I wanted to open the conversation about cultural attitudes in terms of the national frame of American land. And in your writing, the vastness and relative openness of American land, particularly in the West, but throughout, you've associated with the history of American identity formation. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see that notion of cultural identity playing out in terms of individual choices, helped along, of course, by public policy, as Vashon just reminded us, but individual choices about where and how we live, how much space we take up as individuals, as families.
It's so lovely to be here. Thank you architecturally, Cassim, Rosalie, Jonathan, etc. It's great being here, and this is a really interesting follow-up for somebody who came here partly for the climate march on Sunday. And does anybody in the room know what the most urban state in the United States is?
Rhode Island.
Do you want to try that again?
I would have guessed Rhode Island too.
Nevada, which has about 2.5 million people, 2 million of them in Las Vegas, and about 425,000 of them in the Carson-Sparks-Reno cluster, leaving a place about the size of Germany to a very tiny number of people. I've been thinking about that. I had a very close friend who lived in Baker, Nevada. Has anybody here ever heard of Baker, Nevada? I didn't think so. Which is 70 miles from the nearest grocery store. And it was an interesting thing. She actually had built her own home, reusing mining timbers and local stone and things like that, and in many ways lived incredibly ecologically and was a great environmental activist. She's part of why western Utah and eastern Nevada were not turned into a giant sort of shell game for missiles, so it would soak up all the Soviet missiles, the MX missile business, for those of you who remember it. But it was 70 miles to the grocery store. And then there's Las Vegas, which is the sort of tail that wags the dog in Nevada now because 4/5 of the state's population lives there. But when I started hanging out in Nevada a lot in the late 80s as an anti-nuclear activist, it was a city of about 500,000 people. So you have this massive population that has no relationship to anything, to the desert, because it's all golf courses and lawns and space is kind of denying where it is in deep and profound ways. And, so I think it's complicated. It's interesting listening to this because I ran away from suburbia to Paris when I was 17, and then I moved to San Francisco, which is the second densest major metropolitan area in the country. And there's just some way it feels like the suburbs are failing, and part of how we can tell that is that privileged people want to live in cities and are now shoving, having abandoned cities to poor people of color. They're now shoving the poor people of color into suburbs, and it's kind of like, it's like siblings, where it's like, wait a minute, I gave you the good one, I'm going to have it back, you can have that one. And it's just interesting. I think the suburbs are going to fail in some epic way. I talk with my friend Teddy Cruz, the architect, about retrofitting suburbia for civilization. And some of you, I'm sure, this is what you do. I don't really know kind of how you do it with some of those things. And I don't know what happens to people who drive 70 miles for groceries. My wonderful environmentalist friend is passed away last year, but there's a lot of Americans who have to drive 70 miles for groceries.
And a lot of that, do you attribute some of the ways in which Americans have historically chosen to live in the 20th century to particular aspects of American culture, specifically American culture, in terms of whether it's manifest destiny or a desire for a particular kind of lawn. I mean,
and there's that idea of rugged individualism, and that, you know, Pa Ingalls in the Little House on the Prairie books wanted to move when he could see the smoke of someone else's chimney. And there's a kind of rhetorical language of not wanting other people in your space and wanting autonomous territory, which you now see particularly among the rich. And Mike Davis talks about public luxury, which is, and you live in Manhattan, you have great swimming pools, libraries, theaters. You can, if you want to work out, you can go to the gym. If you want to swim, you can go to, you know, to a luxury private gym pool, if not a public pool and stuff. And there's a way that people build these houses that are pseudo self-sufficient with this idea, this deep, and it's one of the things I've talked about a lot. There's a very different context of economic globalization. I always feel that before you can have economic privatization, you have to have psychological privatization, which is a sense that the Thatcher sense of there is no such thing as society. I owe you nothing, I need nothing from you, you need nothing from me. And that withdrawal, and of course it's totally bogus, you know, inside all those McMansions with gyms and theaters and et cetera, you know, there's plumbing and there's water and there's electricity. They're so not self-sufficient, but there's this kind of denial. It's interesting looking at people like the Koch brothers who use the language, and they didn't want to, you can't really say communism anymore and make people frightened. But they have this very similar language about communalism, that the idea that we have things in common and need do things in common and share things in common. And right-wing philosophy right now is a kind of atomized philosophy of we have no responsibility for each other and nothing is connected to anything else. Sex education is not connected to lowered teen pregnancy. Education is not connected to lowered poverty. You know, of course, there's the left-wing version where vaccines are not connected to lowered disease rates. But you just, you know, and climate denialism is this, what 7 billion people do has nothing to do with the health of the planet.
Right.
And, you know, and so it's interesting looking, I think Americans, not all of us, because we're an incredibly diverse country, and there's a lot of people who, you know, who are environmentalists who do want to believe that John Muir thing, minus the fact that John Muir said it while doing incredibly racist things against Native Americans at Lake Tenaya in Yosemite, which I've written about a lot, that when you reach out for anything, you find it connected to everything else in the world, except Indians in his version. And, you know, there are a lot of people, I digress, which is all I really do for those of you who
well, that's okay. That's
there are a lot of people who do want in various ways to be connected and to address those connections. I mean, the 400,000 strong climate march and the 2,700 sister demonstrations simultaneously in 170 something other countries shows that. But I do think Americans suffer from this isolationist, individualist problem.
So I want to get back in a moment to that question of psychological privatization and sort of the tension between how we work as a community and some of our individual choices in terms of what we can do about this. But mentioning the march and also mentioning the roots and the context of your own environmental activism in terms of the anti-nuclear movement, I was wondering, just speaking personally, if you could speak to how you have seen environmental activism change over the years. I'm thinking in particular about the growing tension, as I see it, between a logic of wildlife or habitat preservation, some of which we heard about a little bit earlier today, save the trees, save the planet, that sort of discourse, and a different one, on the other hand, of reducing our demand for energy and consumption patterns while developing renewable forms of energy. I mean, how would you characterize shifts in environmental activism over the years?
I know, you know, there's interesting ways to think about it. There are specific, I know environmentalists in the Mojave Desert who really hate the giant solar collectors, which are impacting wildlife. And there's this very odd thing now. I talked about what Clark University last week, where people get very upset about birds dying in wind turbines and solar collectors, those giant solar collectors that beam, you know, incredibly high-powered rays to the salt towers fry the birds that fly through, more or less literally. And it's interesting because it's like half the birds in the United States are going to lose almost all their habitat in a very short amount of time if we keep doing what we're doing. But petroleum mostly doesn't kill birds directly, although I've seen oil-soaked birds in the BP spill personally. You know, it's been really interesting. And I became an environmentalist in the mid-1980s, and it was really still the conservation movement. It was still about putting fences around isolated places to protect them in a way that often essentially encouraged everything else to go forward. And you see it with the birth of Yosemite and Yellowstone and things like that, what I call the virgin whore dichotomy. It's like, this place nothing will happen to, and we imagine nature as static and fragile and separate. This is the virgin. And then this place will just rape and destroy and, you know, strip mining, and Yosemite was protected, which just turned 150. Abraham Lincoln, somewhere over there, signed it into being while the gold rush was going on, to have one place in the utter ravishment of the Sierra Nevada that wasn't ravaged. But what was really interesting coming of age in the late 80s as an environmentalist is that it was actually the rainforest activists who were saying, wait a minute, wilderness is not virgin. We're looking at the Amazon, at Borneo, and places at Central America, and these are inhabited wildernesses. And it was it came as the build-up to the quincentennial was happening, where Native peoples basically said, fuck Columbus, we weren't discovered, we were invaded, and we are still here, the story is not over, which was a huge cataclysm, I think, in consciousness in both hemispheres, and really helped lead to the Zapatistas, to Evo Morales as the president of Bolivia.
So you're talking about 92 as a moment.
Yeah, well, in the late 80s, which is this moment of people saying, wait a minute, there isn't this nature-culture divide. And I think that wilderness is part of it. You look at New York, which has this giant preserved watershed so there can be drinking water. And wilderness, you know, we're looking at what's happening to the Arctic, and these things I don't think we can imagine them separately. And I think you can have both. And,
so you see a convergence.
I think that people are focusing on different things. Environmental justice is on human inhabited spaces, and it doesn't talk about polar bears, except in the rare case when it's talking about Inuit, Nunavut kinds of stuff.
Right.
But I think that they're actually interfused in deep ways, and that we can talk about both of them. And I think there's an interesting way in which climate activism, I always hate seeing 350 lumped in with the big green groups, because it's about 7 years old and it's not big, and it's not, it doesn't come with some of the same baggage, and it almost immediately started building global alliances. So, you know, it came out of Vermont and was very white, but it immediately started reaching out to Cambodia and Ghana and et cetera. So I think that, I think that those things really are connected, and that you can see, and climate ultimately is an ultimatum that we all recognize that everything is connected, that when if the ice in the Arctic melts, people in the South Pacific go underwater, maybe chunks of Manhattan and a lot of the Atlantic coast and Florida and et cetera, and the Amazon mouth go underwater. You know, and it's interesting. It does feel like our grasp has exceeded our reach, that we can now impact everything, and we now have to be able to think as big as we do, in a sense. And that's where environmentalism is now, is trying to transcend conservation and individual protection and nature-culture divides and et cetera, to this kind of whole systemic thinking.
Do you see within that the possibility for new kinds of coalitions, not just within different strains of environmentalism, but between environmental movements and other kinds of social movements? I mean, you mentioned the indigenous movement, but then there's, any number of what some might argue are more immediate claims making going on in terms of income and lots of other sort of economic justice and social justice issues. Do you see a convergence, or the possibility of a convergence there, and what sort of potential might that offer to us all?
The New York Times did a piece, I forget if it was this Monday or earlier, saying that essentially it turns out that renewable and clean energy don't actually cost any more than carbon energy now, and we don't even have a carbon tax yet. I think that there's a real possibility, and there was a moment when climate change activists were saying, oh, I'm sorry, Global South, you can't develop. And now I think it's really about, okay, Global South, you get to go straight to this fabulous clean energy and not have all the hideous problems of coal generation that China's demonstrating now, as England demonstrated. You know, only 60 years ago, people were dying in large numbers of coal burning in London. And so I think that the technology keeps changing so rapidly. It really is kind of changing everything in some ways. And I think that, and there's other ways you look at it, where climate change is a social justice issue, because already about 150,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa are suffering, and that's absolutely the place where people will get completely devastated. We have climate refugees already. We have climate wars already, and a lot of it is in Africa, where desertification and crop failure impact the poor. And it is, it's funny because environmentalism has always been demonized as a luxury issue, as though poor people don't want nature and clean air and clean water, as though poor people don't care if there's a rich and diverse and sustainable environment. But now it's particularly a survival issue for them. The descendants of the Kochs and the Obamas will live generations probably in hiding as the people who the descendants of the people who destroyed the world. But the poor will die now, and grain production is down 7% already because of climate disruption, and that impacts the poor immediately. So I think it absolutely, it depends. There are people who are phrasing it, in elite ways, but most of the people I'm around absolutely see it as a social justice and populist issue, and that wilderness is not distinct from it.
And certainly locally, the environmental justice movement, which certainly had a lot to do in its early formation with the sort of location and siting of heavy infrastructure in predominantly poor, disinvested neighborhoods, definitely found a common cause between environmental movements and poor people's movements more generally. But I'm also hearing you mention a lot of the interconnectedness at the global scale too. We heard earlier today about supply chains and how the ways products are fabricated and the distances they travel around the world, and how these sort of obscure questions of scale and complicate questions of individual choices. So I've always really been taken by your writing about sort of place and the flows, some are visible, some invisible, that all sort of synthesized to create what we experience as place. I'm wondering, when you're thinking about notions of land or place in the American context, how do you conceptualize the global flows that influence how terrain and property is produced or experienced?
And something that's come up repeatedly is that addressing climate change means addressing capitalism as, the logic of endless growth and sequestered profit and exploitation is destroying the planet. And Naomi Klein's new book looks specifically at how the free trade agreements that started to go into effect in the 1980s made it infinitely harder to do what we need to do about the climate. I don't know if we need to absolutely dismantle capitalism, but I know that we're essentially it is capitalism versus the planet, as her subtitle has it. I think for me as a storyteller, a lot of it is about we need to change the story. Walmart, I think, is a good paradigm for exemplar of this kind of ruthless exploitation that leads to, in the developing world, endless consumption in the developed world, the sequestering of profit, so that you have these individuals who have a level of wealth that's completely obscene. I think that the Walton family is as wealthy as the 40% of the poorest 40% of Americans, and that's just so grotesquely disproportionate. It absolutely shouldn't exist. And I think that the part of the storytelling thing is the climate movement got off to a very bad start in its light bulb and Al Gore-ish way, and I think that what we need. And what essentially people were told is we're rich now, and now we're going to have to be poor, and we'll all be thrifty, and and I think that there's a different story, which is that we're very poor now. We're poor in confidence about the future. We're poor in community. We're poor in leisure. When I say confidence about the future, it's our own future. How do I know that I'll have health care in 5 years? I don't know what my retirement will look like, or if I'll ever retire. I don't know what my planet will look like. I don't know what it'll look like for my nieces and nephews and things like that. We have so little security of any kind from the most metaphysical to the most practical in this country. And, I think looking at the ways that we're poor, that our food is produced in ways that are deeply alienated for both the producers and the consumers and destructive, that everything is a kind of extractive and exploitative industry. And that's profound poverty. If we can say, look at what would it look like to produce food and clothing and furniture and houses in ways that are sustainable, where maybe, I like old things, so most of the things in my house are older than me, that actually we can have chairs that last 200 years instead of chairs that you throw out when you move that come from Walmart and IKEA. And what would it look like to reframe what wealth is and to see how wealthy we'll be if we do what we need to do in response to climate change, which is to live in deep relationship to the people around us and to the systems around us, and to play a role in them, whether it's producing some of our own food, having composting toilets, having long-term relationships with objects rather than disposable ones, being less material-oriented, and maybe more social and creativity-oriented.
And certainly part of the sort of broader project of which this symposium is only one part, the 5,000-pound life project, aims to conceptualize a 5,000-pound life that is a life of different kinds of abundance, not necessarily one of austerity and renunciation.
Exactly.
But what might that life look like? And so you mentioned the role of storytelling in all of this, which is in many ways runs counter perhaps to the story of numbers and abstractions and flows that permeate this discussion. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of storytelling as you see it, in helping us get where we need to be.
And the poet Muriel Rukeyser once said, "The world is not made out of atoms, it's made out of stories," which you can't really say to architects who design things made out of atoms. I design things.
They also tell really good stories.
They do. And and it's interesting seeing how much the discipline, and looking at places like the Architectural League, which used to be very literally architectural, as I understand it, dealing with buildings, that now, and buildings in a sense are like words, but urban systems are narratives, and they're novels of incredible, complex, interrelated Dickensian character. And the way that the field itself has become much more system-oriented. And, I think that, but the sense in which the world is made out of stories is that, climate denialism is a story, and the sense that we can't do anything is a story. The sense that America is still a democracy is a story. And that there are, we have these hideous media. It was interesting walking past Fox News on the climate march, and that tell really destructive stories. And part of it is that you are what you consume, and is all in a deeper sense, the sitcoms and things that I think trivialize people's sense of their own humanity. There's no spirituality, no social responsibility, no metaphysics, no intellectuality, no deep social engagement in Cheers and Friends and all those sitcoms. They really banalize. I feel like they wither away the broad extensions of what it means to be human. But I feel with climate specifically, a lot of people are terrified to face it, and the analogy for me is people who won't face an illness and therefore won't treat it, and et cetera, that thing. How do you get somebody to acknowledge that cigarette smoke may lead to lung cancer, or that now that you have lung cancer, maybe you want to go for some of these harsh but productive treatments that might cause you to survive it? And then also, but I feel like the biggest story we have to tell is that we can change the world profoundly. And that, first of all, means coming out of the weird amnesiac narrative in this country that climate activists are these terrible people who want to destroy the steady state that we've been in. Because, it's never been steady, and it's absolutely unsteady. And 25 years ago, this was the Tom Dispatch essay that came out a week ago yesterday. I did in preparation for the climate march. 25 years ago, there were all these interesting stirrings in Eastern Europe. Hungarians were flowing into no, East Germans were going into Hungary and then leaving the Soviet bloc. And all these people, Margaret Thatcher flew to Russia to tell Gorbachev to prevent the Berlin Wall from collapsing because it would be calamitous. Everybody in power, the status quo loves the status quo. The more powerful you are, the more invested in it you are. They either didn't believe anything was going to change profoundly or they thought it would be very bad if it did. And of course, then it all changed in November of 1989. And, and I think that, we need to tell the story that everything's changing all the time. The world has never been stable. It's been extraordinarily unstable over the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution and all the social revolutions since then. And that not to be terrified of change. And then I think we also have to tell the story of how incredibly poor we are now, which is not a marketing story, which wants to convince you you're just one pair of jeans and facelift away from being completely rich or something. So I think we need to tell the story of our poverty, the story of a world in flux in which it will change regardless, but we actually get to participate in how it changes, and we can make a change in many ways for the better.
And story, of course, obviously has a very, very deep and resonant relationship with place and how we understand place. I mean, another thing that Naomi Klein mentions in the way that she talks about her most recent book is she's obviously an expert at analyzing logos and visual communication as well from her earlier work, but she shows the image of the planet seen from space as the symbol and logo of a variety of different environmental movements, and contrast that with an image or a story of a real place as experienced, because unless you're God or an astronaut, you're not looking at the world that way. And I think there's a relationship there into the image you were conjuring earlier of community and a deeper sense of relationship to the people around us and the systems around us. I mean, climate change, of course, is not one challenge, but a series of overlapping ones, including consumption, as we've heard about, settlement patterns, as we've heard about, energy production and distribution, manufacturing, supply chains, logistics, infrastructure investment. And it's true that the scope of the challenge is planetary in terms of its implications, but so much so that the role of the community is obscured. I agree with Alex Glaskin that not every place is right for everything, and we shouldn't necessarily imagine that every place across the planet is evenly suited for agricultural production, for example. But I'm just sort of interested in how you conceptualize the role of the community in getting to where we need to get on the climate.
During the Bush administration, when all address of climate change was stalled on a national scale and as a result on a global scale, it was really interesting seeing how much it was this bottom-up version of I don't know who pointed out that all the major mayors in the country except one are Democrats, but there has been this really interesting local stuff with the Council of Mayors, with governors, with regional things, with people voting on local stuff. Some of the counties in the Bay Area are heading for a completely clean electrical generation. The mayor of San Francisco, who's horrible, but a Democrat, part of the evil Democratic machine of Willie Brown, we have a clean power program absolutely in place that he won't let us implement because he's in the power company's pockets. And then California has I forget what the ratios are, but by 2020 we're supposed to have a pretty high green energy, 33%. And is it 100% by 2050? I'm a Californian, I should know, but we know that my non-Google search engine knows that. So I think that the local scale is, that both climate demands that we more deeply connect to the local in a lot of ways, and that a lot of it can be done and will be done on a local scale. I absolutely think we need a global treaty of some kind. Because a lot of it also is decided globally, and I don't know if we'll get there. The fact that the 7 billion people on Earth are being obstructed by political minority in one house of one government on Earth, namely the Republicans in the Senate, who won't ratify any climate treaties, is incredibly terrifying. we'll see what happens.
We'll see what happens. All right, we're going to move to questions from the audience in just a minute. So if anybody has one, feel free to move towards the microphones. But I have one last question for you, just because you mentioned Google Maps. And so I do want to talk a little bit about your current work. Because you've been thinking a lot recently about maps, about what maps can obscure and what they can illuminate. I'm thinking of the Atlas projects, which if you guys haven't seen, please make an effort to check out. And I've heard you speak in other contexts about the pervasive digital technology and the way that it drives the mapification of daily life and homogenizes perhaps our awareness of place and history in certain ways, reducing our ability to navigate and understand the sort of scales, distances, proximities, and the interdependencies that we've been talking about a lot throughout the various panels today. Maps are obviously a hugely important tool in land use planning, where we think about it in terms of zoning and the plan view. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the potential of creative map making and how that might be able to reveal aspects of our urban environments that might encourage a more nuanced relationship with land and place.
Yeah, it might come in as a bunch of fragments. One of the things that's been really interesting about being in New York for the last couple of weeks is seeing how often people riding the subway refer to the map, and that this is a place where people are reading paper maps, although I also saw a guy with it on his iPad. But, I started doing atlases because I love maps. I felt like there was a possibility of describing cities as a place of infinite coexistences and overlaps, and which is why the first one is called Infinite City, and to kind of revive what happens with paper maps when they're beautiful, when they're imaginative, when they're unpredictable. And it was partly a revolt against Google Maps in particular and online mapping in general. And, it's partly a design problem. Google Maps, as you call it up on your computer 99% of the time, there's all these amazing things you can do if you're technologically sophisticated and you go into Second Life and look at historic maps scanned into Google Maps and things like that. But I don't, that's not what people do 99.9% of the time. You look at Google Maps, it's incredibly ugly as a design thing. The inverted teardrop is an incredibly annoying phenomenon. It doesn't actually work that well and stuff. Like, it doesn't show you rivers. I've tried to look at rivers on Google Maps, and all they show you is transit, and then people put restaurants, and they put consumerism on the map. And so it's a map of getting around and buying shit, which is just so reductive. There are no butterfly migration routes. There are no historic queer sites, things that I put on my maps. And then there's an interesting way. The way people use online mapping is essentially they subjugate themselves to an authoritarian voice, and literally with those devices in your car, like in 200 yards, turn right. And I was given a Garmin device, one of the earlier versions, after Hurricane Katrina, when I started spending a lot of time in New Orleans, and I also had a $5 gas station map. And the Garmin device was useful. New Orleans it is a very violent city, which at that point didn't have street lights and street signs in a lot of places, and your car got flat tires a lot. And but I found the more I used the paper map, the more I was the map. That you command a map, and you use it. You decide what you have to. First, you have to think, which is what I think interactivity is. Interactivity is not necessarily typing in commands or, moving a joystick. And I found that I became a map of New Orleans. I can do most of what I need to do in New Orleans these days without stuff. So I was interested in that old way in which maps let you make, you command them, you make decisions, you interpret them, and they make demands. And it's interesting, living in San Francisco, which has been overtaken by Silicon Valley, speaking of the destruction of beautiful, dense places by gentrification and homogenization. I'm actually a little bit terrified of the next big earthquake, which will probably happen in the next 15 years or so. Because people who only know how to move through the world like this, I know a young person who goes to college about 3 hours away from San Francisco. You basically go on 580 for about 70, you go on 80 for about 70 miles, and then you take a left turn, and then you go for another 70 miles. It's basically the map if I drew the map, it would look like a dog leg. But she streams Google Maps on her phone the whole time because she hasn't internalized the map. She does not know how to get to her university without something streaming continuously. And I just worry about people who don't have that relationship to place. And it's interesting because I think that the phones breed that. At the same time that I think the urban gardening movement, the passionate response to my kind of mapping, et cetera, suggests that there's an appetite for this other stuff, but the dominant culture is this kind of erasure of becoming a map, of internalizing a map that you get with paper maps and with navigating in other ways.
What would you say is that other stuff? There's a desire for what exactly on the part of?
And it's interesting. I have seen so many mason jars in New York City, and which are this kind of like hilariously overused. And I say this as somebody who's been canning for 25 years. This hilariously overused emblem of authentic, down-home, rugged, grainy, back to nature hipsterdom, and it's interesting looking at how much stuff is going on now, how many people are involved in gardening. There are more farming. The number of farmers in the United States has gone up the last few years for the first time in more than a century. There are so many urban garden projects now. I annoy college students by saying that baby boomers had sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You have gardens. Many of them would prefer to have more sex, or maybe both. But that there is this deep engagement with this deep desire to be locally grounded and rooted. The incredible explosion of farmers markets over the last 20 years. There are these ways in which people not only desire to be connected again, bike paths and bicycling. There's so many bikes in Manhattan compared to even 10 years ago. That a lot of these little solutions are out there. And one of the ways that I try not to be a typical leftist is that the rhetorical framework is always like, everything right now is terrible and we need to start from scratch on forming a solution. And I always look at it as there are all these amazing things that exist, and the solution is to just scale them up: more bicycles, more farms, not necessarily more mason jars, unless they're actually being used to can things. And so I'm interested in that kind of stuff, and those desires that are so strong. People yearn for a lot of these things so much, which is why maps and farmers markets and gardens and things now make people really happy. There is this desire for the life to be very different.
Create a sense of connection to some of those things you were talking about earlier, the people around you and where your food comes from.
Exactly. And a lot of what people like at farmers markets isn't just that you get really good tomatoes, but it's that you feel like you're related to the earth, to the farmer. The level of interactions are much higher. It's friendlier, and it's non-alienated. And people want that stuff. And so.
Do you have a question, sir?
People want to ask questions, we assume, too.
Yes. Should I speak? Yes.
Yes.
So there's this interesting thing happening now where designers, architects, landscape architects, like we were talking about before, are starting to get into this whole environmental territory. Yeah. And we also don't really know exactly what we're doing yet. And then you have this old environmental group that has been changing over the decades. And so I liked how you mentioned like the whore and the virgin. And so
virgins and whores, yeah.
Yeah, and so there's this interesting thing of like, no one's going to get upset at you if you put a new park in New York City because there's nothing there. It's like concrete. So yes, like let's do something environmental. And then you've got like the forest that you don't touch. But there's like this really contested territory in between of these places that kind of have nature, kind of have ecosystems that are working, and then you have designers coming in who want to augment them and help them in a way. And so you have this kind of intense optimism of the designer, and then you maybe have laws, policies, or environmentalists who are worried about what could go wrong almost, because they've been protecting for so long. So you have this like optimism and pessimism, and sometimes too extreme on both ends, and now they're meeting for the first time. And I was wondering if you could speak to like maybe how you've seen changes over the decades, how environmental groups are rethinking that about actually kind of augmenting and adding and getting into the mix more, I guess.
You mean to working with urbanists and planning and design and architecture?
Sure. Well, so an example was like I was working on a project where there's this wetland in a farm, and the farm was converting back to a wetland.
Yeah.
And so there's like this demarcated zone, and if you go into that zone, suddenly it's just like a total mess. Like no one wants to touch the wetland zone because it's such a problem. But the wetland isn't necessarily that great of a wetland right now. The habitat isn't really that great of a place. So ideally, you could come in and augment that in a habitat, ecologically productive way, but instead we just don't even touch it because regulation is such a mess to actually get into it. And some environmentalists might even say, like, we don't want you to touch it, just leave it how it is, I guess. And so there's like this odd tension back and forth that I've experienced, and I was wondering if you could talk through that.
And part of what's been interesting with the change I was talking about with Native people asserting their existence with the Rainforest Movement, recognizing that wilderness has been human space for over most of the earth and stuff, is about the idea that, there isn't pristine, untouched nature, so it's okay. It's not a question of, should we not touch it at all, but like how do we touch it? How do we impact it? And it's interesting looking at the most remote places on Earth, the Arctic and Antarctica, being so impacted by things done from very far away with climate change, at the black soot that's blackening the surface of Greenland, hastening the melt and things. So it just feels like it's a sort of pragmatic question of does it work? And it's interesting. I think that urbanism and architecture do have a history, or urban planning. My father was an urban planner, a fairly good one actually, I think, but just in a sort of zoning code and preservation way. And the real question is, does it work? And there are a lot of utopian ideas that turn out to not be how people actually want to live or how they actually use space. Although I feel like that the new kinds of urban design and architecture are much better at the kind of ground up of like, what do people want? How do they actually live? How do they move around? Rather than saying, here's this exciting machine for living, you will now inhabit it. And ignoring these things that don't work. And like I'm thinking about like mid-century housing projects and the whole language of blight that was used to destroy lovely 19th century housing and replace it with Bauhaus cinder block prisons and things, and without the eyes on the street and stuff. So, that's my sense of it.
I would just add to that. I think we heard a little bit at the very beginning about the growth imperative and some of the ways that's problematic and has certain limits in terms of our carrying capacity. But there was also something that one might consider the efficiency imperative. In the logistics panel in particular, there was a lot of talk about efficiency as this unqualified, good, which makes a lot of sense in terms of the way that we've conceptualized energy in particular. But I would have loved to have gone back to the nature and the city panel to talk a little bit more about redundancy and how that can be sort of designed into some of these systems, because I think the example that you raised about the wetland that's not a particularly good wetland also speaks to some of the tensions that you were talking about as far as walling off certain parts of a preservationist logic around environmentalism, and how that needs to move towards more of the ecological logic of interdependencies. And I don't know how that shift gets manifested, but I think some of what Charles Waldheim was talking about as far as the pedagogical models might actually help get us there. Is there another question?
First of all, I just want to thank you for the piece you wrote for Tom Dispatch. Recently, I read it the morning after flooding Wall Street in a sort of existential hangover, and I think it just sort of really helped to kind of frame and contextualize what comes next. So thank you. And you've written beautifully about the communities that can arise out of disaster. And I'm just curious if, after the experience of being here for the past couple of weeks as part of the climate march and kind of being engaged with all these discussions with climate movements, if you see the potential for that kind of response either scaling up or kind of anticipating the disasters that are coming.
Or are we in a paradise built in hell?
Are we in a paradise built in hell?
Yeah.
They're working very hard at building the hell, whether we make a paradise out of it. The hells are givens, the paradises are sometimes arise, sometimes are squelched. And, I was actually thinking about that work in relationship to this conversation. I did a bunch of research on disaster and was really interested in the way the authorities assume that we revert to our barbaric Hobbesian, war of each against each, which is why they crack down on authoritarian ways, notably in Katrina, but equally as badly in the 1906 earthquake, and often in disasters, when in fact most people are deeply empathic, communitarian, resourceful, creative, extremely well behaved. But what was so interesting for me about that when I did that book on disaster was not just that we behave nicely, which is often seen as this, we rise to the occasion and it's so nice, but that people really deeply yearn for purpose, meaning, solidarity, connection, immediacy. And there's a way a disaster is like a carnival, and that, it disrupts all ordinary things and draws you in to this immediacy. There's a way in which it reveals everyday life as a disaster of alienation and anomie and meaninglessness for the great majority of people in the industrialized world who essentially make widgets for WidgetCo at best. And suddenly, you're taking care of the seniors and you're running the community kitchen and you're improvising shelter, or you're keeping the generators running or something. People have, what amazed me and what made me write a book about it was the incredible joy for something we don't even have words for mostly, because we don't talk about what I call public love. We talk about private love all the time, which is erotic and familial and, private life. It's part of the privatization. We don't talk about civic, okay, you all do, but you're weird too. And, but there's incredible joy. And I talked to people about who were in Lower Manhattan in 9/11. I talked to people in Katrina. I read all these amazing accounts of the 1906 earthquake. I talked to people about blackouts and floods and things. And often there was this incredible joy, and it was this joy of being engaged in the way that I think hunter-gatherers and villagers often were, and we seldom are, and which suggests that if only we can rename where we are now as disaster, and some of the things that need to change is not disaster, the disaster of not living in such big houses, of not having nearly as many private commodities and things, then we can really start to make those changes. And I wrote the book as well because I think we're in the midst of a greatly, it's funny, the book came out in 2009. I assumed we were going to be in an era of greatly heightened and intensified disasters. 5 years later, we're definitely way deep in it. And we need to understand how people behave very specifically in disaster, but also look at these deeper, bigger desires, which tell us and it's interesting because capitalism and Madison Avenue has bombarded us for decades, telling us that we're stupid, selfish, banal animals who just want to get laid and own lots of stuff and maybe kill things on video games or kill things in real life, and that we have lots of enemies and that we have no connection to anything. And the fact that people still in disasters, are completely not like that, and that makes them happy to not be like that, I think is so indicative of something that's very deeply embedded in who we are, and something very deep about who we want to be, which suggests that if we can change the language in which poverty, and reverse the terms of poverty, of wealth, and overcome some of the dominant stories, the stories that make people alienated consumers, because you have to be alienated to be a good consumer. And
well, I think that's sounding a note of cautious optimism. Is that a mischaracterization?
Optimism I see as this kind of passive sense that things will be fine, just like pessimism assumes things will be terrible no matter what we do. I just think hope. Yeah, no, I wrote a book on hope too.
So should we?
I think that there's some hope.
Do we have time for any more questions, or should we end on hope? Okay. So with a hopeful concluding thought, I want to thank everybody so much for being here and sticking it throughout this very stimulating day. It's given us all a lot to think about. Thank you all very much for being here.